Welcome to the Startup Competitors Podcast, where we talk with early-stage entrepreneurs to understand what information they use to inform product roadmap, strategy, and market differentiation.
Welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Mike Kelly, and today we have Dora Lutz from Giving Spring.
Hi.
Dora, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Why don't we start off with an overview of Giving Spring?
Sure. I'd love to. So Giving Spring builds aspirational businesses. So what that means is we help leaders who want to create organizations that build purpose and profitability at the same time through coaching, consulting, and training opportunities.
Awesome. And then you have a lot of things going on. You just published, you're getting ready to publish a book.
Yep. Getting ready to publish The Aspirational Business.
Aspirational Business, which you let me read a couple of early chapters. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Looking forward to that. You teach at Purdue?
I do.
Is that right?
I do. So a lot of these things seem disparate, but they're actually all parts of the same puzzle. So I teach business planning for social entrepreneurs at Purdue. I also am an entrepreneur in residence at the Purdue Foundry, where I work with social entrepreneurs. And then I have Giving Spring, which is really how do we help existing businesses build towards profitability and purpose.
All right. Maybe if somebody is listening who hasn't heard of social entrepreneurship, why don't you start with maybe a high-level overview of what that means and what you think that means, and then what are some other meanings that may have been assigned out in the world that may or may not disagree with you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there are a lot of different perspectives of what social entrepreneurship means. So some people think that social entrepreneurship means that you're an organization that is trying to solve a social issue. Some people perceive it as being more of a nonprofit. Some people perceive it as being a for-profit that just doesn't make significant amounts of profitability, right? That they figure out how to give away a significant portion of their products, or more of a Tom's Shoes, buy one, give one model. So there's a lot of different ways that somebody can look at this, and not everybody has the exact same definition for what social entrepreneurship means. In my world, and that's why I came up with the aspirational business, because there are so many different ways that people could look at it. In my world, if you want to be a social entrepreneur, you have to build a business that focuses on a social issue that also creates profitability. Because if you don't have profitability, you don't have sustainability, and you're not meeting your responsibility for long-term benefit. And if you're not solving a social issue in some form or fashion, then you're just a traditional business, which there's not anything wrong with that. It just is a slightly different take on what people are looking for when they build their businesses.
Yeah.
So I say the aspirational business has 5 different key components. Would you like me to go through those?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the 5 components are, first off, you create a vision of servanthood that goes beyond serving your customers or creating jobs. So my perspective is that creating jobs is just what businesses do, right? And there's no inherent value in the number of jobs you create. I know that some people will highly disagree with me, but if you could have an organization that is solving malaria and you've got 10 people, or you've got an organization that's solving malaria and it has 100 people, I'm not sure that one has more moral value than the other. So it needs to have a vision of servanthood that goes beyond customers and creating jobs. And of course, serving your customers is just table stakes for any business you're going to create. That's the first one. The second one is able to measure both financial performance and social impact. So if you measure only social impact and you're not considering your financial KPIs, then traditionally you'd be maybe looked at as more of a nonprofit. If you're focusing just on your financial KPIs and you're not thinking about your social impact, then you'd fall into more of that traditional business model. So social entrepreneurship looks at both sides of those equations and makes sure that they can measure both of those. The next thing an aspirational business does is it creates an opportunity where employees thrive. So it makes sure that your employees have a living wage, that you are doing your best to address any issues from the external world that are making it hard for them to have a good quality of life. So that is the third. Fourthly, after that, you create operational processes that align with your vision. So if you say that you care about employee safety, but at the end of the day, you don't take the operational initiative to make sure that your people are actually operating safely, then that creates a significant issue, and that would prevent you from being an aspirational business.
Is that like the last thing you said there made me think more of like OSHA than E-Myth Revisited, Operationalize Your Business. Am I hearing that right? Is that more like is it more about like a safe, productive work environment, or is it more of the like, no, when you operationalize your business and align that with your vision, it is more about like the operation, like the detailed operations of the business, like you would have in a E-Myth kind of a way.
Yeah, I think it's about aligning with the vision that you have. You have to meet all minimum governance and regulatory standards. Again, that's table stakes. If you're not doing that, you're not operating in a way that I think you can be.
That's expected. Employees thriving.
That's right.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, right? If you say we are going to, and let's take it out of the employee side, let's say it's an environmental issue, right? We care about the environment, but then you're dumping chemicals in a river, that would prevent you from meeting your vision, but it also means that you're not meeting your regulatory standards. I mean, you just have to be able to do that or you're not going to avoid organizational risk in the long run.
Okay. Sorry. Fifth step.
No, that's good. But let me say one other thing. So you meet your governance and your governance and regulatory requirements, but in that alignment with the vision, you may need to go above and beyond. So if you say you're going to be an automobile manufacturer who creates sustainable vehicles, right, with an environmental focus, then you have to make sure that all of your processes are aligned so that you actually do that, right? Because if you say we care about creating green vehicles and then your engineers are falsifying emissions testing, you've totally blown, and you may know who I'm talking about, you've totally blown your vision out of the water, right? And then that's where you lose the benefit of consumer and employee engagement in your vision.
Right.
Okay. I could come up with a few other examples of that, but we'll stop there. So the fifth one is that you market based on the truth of your organization, which is to say your marketing team tells the story of those other 4 areas. So what your vision is and how you're living it out, not a catchy slogan that would like to tell an organization what you do, but everybody knows doesn't pass the sniff test, that's not actually what your organization is about.
Okay. Of all of those, the one that I think trips me up the most is number 2, right? The ability to measure both KPIs, performance indicators, as well as impact.
Yeah.
I have to imagine this is probably one of the most common questions. How do you measure impact? Like once you've set a vision for what you want to do to be aspirational, how do companies go about trying to figure out how do we measure that? How would we report it? What does that look like?
Mm-hmm. You're right. I mean, it isn't something that's intuitive to us because in the business world, we're taught that profitability is the only thing that matters. So we know how to put together our financial reports very easily. And so you have to be smart about how you're pulling those identifiers and what you're choosing to measure. But anything is better than nothing. And also, if you're doing it wisely, you should be able to partner with your nonprofit organizations to help gather that data. So for instance, let's say, let's come up with an example. Let's say we're an organization that cares about educational outcomes in Indianapolis. Let's say that's important to us and important to our mission.
Okay.
Then the question becomes, which part, there's a lot of different pieces in that. So what's more important to you? Do you care about vocational training? Do you care about the quality of students who are going into college? Do you care about the number of students who are graduating high school? Like looking at that pipeline and understanding which area you want to participate in, first, you have to get specific on. This is what we want to do within education. After that, you say, in what region are we going to do that? Right? Are we focused on our local community? Do we want to think about something nationally? Depending on that, who are the players who are working on that and what are the indicators that they're already using? So don't reinvent the wheel. And then out of that, what is our role and how we impact that? So what are we going to do that's going to indicate our success in this space? And then how do you measure that? So is it dollars given? That's a great leading indicator. We're going to give this much money towards educational initiatives. We're going to give this many hours towards mentoring. We're going to do whatever your organization is going to do to advance that is what you should be measuring. And then the outcome metrics, you partner with your nonprofits to understand whether it's being successful or not.
Got it.
Is that clear enough? The other thing that I would add to that are the Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations, whatever you want to say about them in this political climate, all 197 member nations ratified 17 Sustainable Development Goals back in 2017. And so just for a second, think about that. 197 member nations agreed on anything, right? 197 people could decide on like what the best flavor of ice cream is, right? What's clearly mint chocolate chip. They wouldn't be able to agree on that. It is absolutely mint chocolate chip.
It is not mint chocolate chip. Yeah. No.
Well, you tell me what you think it is.
I mean, my family would agree with you that it's mint chocolate chip. I would say the best flavor of ice cream is probably going to be something like a cherry cordial.
That's absolute insanity.
Well, okay. We're going to agree to disagree.
We will agree to disagree. So anyway, 197 member nations agreed on 17 things. And when you look at that, you can look at it and it gets very specific. So you could say, hey, I care about education. This is what I care about in education specifically. I care about vocational. I care about pre-K. I care about whatever it is. And then from there, it tells you who's working in that space and what they're using as key targets. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Got it.
Yeah.
So this podcast is about competition, which is interesting when it comes to social entrepreneurship. If I'm thinking about launching a business or wedging into a market, how could I use the aspirational business model or maybe other tools from social entrepreneurship to help me? Look, is it just marketing that's going to help give me an edge in wedging against my competitors in a given market? Or are there other ways I should be thinking about how an aspirational business model is going to be more of a differentiator for what I'm trying to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. So marketing is an important component because you have to be able to communicate the story of what you're doing. But that is the very last stop in creating value. So from a competitive standpoint, there's a few things. First, understanding social entrepreneurship can help you understand where the opportunities are in a market. So rather than trying to go out and create demand in an industry where there's really no demand, start thinking about where the actual challenges are. And then how does your technology, skill, knowledge, whatever it is, how does it address that challenge instead of having to go out and create a market, right? I'm tired of being sold a bill of goods that my eyelashes aren't long enough, right? I don't care about beauty products. Let's talk about people who are struggling with blindness. Let's talk about things that impact quality of life, and let's figure out how we solve those instead of having to force demand for our product. So that's the first thing in social entrepreneurship. And God knows there are plenty of challenges out there for us to be solving. And usually it's just a matter of looking at the solution you have and saying, how could I tweak this to be to have a bigger purpose? That it is not difficult, but we miss that step sometimes because of what we think we know. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. The second piece is in risk management. So that kind of comes to that operational component. It gives you an opportunity to say, where are we positioned in the market? What are the long-term challenges that are going to impact us? Whether it's an environmental challenge, a supply chain challenge, a labor challenge, a brand perception challenge. Thinking about all of those different pieces can allow you to get ahead when you're building your business, which is obviously more cost effective than having to pivot down the road when you realize that you've run into something. That's the second piece. And then the third is in really the revenue, the profitability side of creating connection with your employees and your stakeholders. So obviously we've both listened to that Freakonomics podcast where they prove that the demand for an organization that is able to prove purpose is, what do they say, 27%? It's equivalent to a 27% increase in pay just from having purpose. So we know that you can attract great people. We know that they will connect with your brand. We know that you will increase retention. And I could spout stats all day. I won't. But you will create better customer loyalty, better employee engagement and retention by having something, having your business aligned with a purpose.
Anything else in terms of like before you get to the marketing? So rather than creating demand, go find a need in the market, thinking through long-term risk management. Yeah. Anything else?
So I'm going to go into shared value, if we can talk about shared value, because I think that's a pretty great way to look at this. And that was I usually will welcome people to shared value and say, welcome to the rabbit hole, because this was the hole for social entrepreneurship that I fell down immediately. So shared value is Michael Porter's second life of how business and organizational strategy and competitiveness intersect. So quick refresher, Michael Porter came up with Porter's 5 forces that allow you to look at an industry and talk and identify whether it's a highly competitive industry before you choose to enter that market.
Do you know? I
was afraid as soon as I said that.
No, it's cool. I've never. I'm not familiar with Porter's 5 forces. I can go do my own. It's okay. I mean to put you on the spot.
Oh man, you know what? So every semester, it turns out that when we teach the 5 forces in Intro to Entrepreneurship, is the same day that we talk about shared value. And so I'm like, it's Michael Porter Day, because I'm a total groupie for Michael Porter. But I am going to I can look them up and talk about them.
No, don't worry about it. I'll go fish. Don't worry about it.
All right, so cut that whole part out.
We're not cutting that part out. No way. It's all good. All right.
I can talk about shared value all day long, but I'm going to blank on the 5 forces.
Don't worry about it. Go to shared value.
Okay. If you don't know what Porter's 5 forces are, I'd suggest that you just go do a quick refresher, right? So before you're going to go into any industry, you should look at it and say, what are the barriers to entry? How competitive is the market? What are the margins? I mean, they're five pretty straightforward things I think most people do intuitively.
Okay.
But it is kind of a nice framework for market validation. So what Michael Porter has come back later in his life and said is, okay, the 5 forces exist, but there are ways that you can reduce competitive forces. And that's what he calls shared value. And so shared value says that businesses can solve a compelling social issue at the same time that they drive profitability. And they can do that in a way that also reduces the competitive pressures on their business. So if you look at the 5 forces and you review those and you say, okay, how does shared value help us think about reducing those competitive pressures? The 3 ways that you can do this, that you can create profitability and solve a social issue, are innovate new products and markets. And I'll give you examples of each of these if you'd like.
Please.
Innovate new products and markets, create collaborative clusters, and address supply chain issues. So these are the 3 key ways that you can look at Porter's 5 forces and say, all right, how do we get past these? So a great example of the first one, which is innovate new products and markets. Innovating new products and markets says, okay, if we tweaked our product just slightly, who could that benefit, right? Is there a way that we could reverse engineer or re-engineer or what's the word I'm looking for? Reductive engineering, right? Can we simplify our product so that it works in a new market that we don't currently have access to? Is there some way that we could innovate our product to get access to a new market? And then how do we partner with other organizations to do that? So a great example is a seasoning company. I think it's Libby's, but I don't have that for sure in my head. Said, all right, we have an issue with anemia in emerging markets in India. And we think that we can subsidize our curry packets with iron in a way that it doesn't reduce the flavor of our product, and it solves a compelling social issue of anemia. So they did that. They basically fortified their curry with iron, curry powders. So now they've reduced incidence of anemia in an emerging market, and they've also elevated the value proposition for a commoditized product. Right. So that's one way that they've engineered an access to new markets.
Great example.
Okay. So that's the first one. The second one is supply chain. So
I thought the second one was creative clusters.
I'm flipping them around.
Beautiful.
Supply chain is because it's the easiest one to get to before you get to the third.
Love it.
Okay. So supply chain enhancement is saying, hey, we've got a long-term issue that's going to impact our business. How do we get ahead of this? And what are the actual root cause issues? So chocolate is a really interesting example right now. We know that in the next 20 years, chocolate supply is going to be diminished, right? Because of climate change or the quality of the bush that they use.
Because of people abusing mint chocolate chip ice cream.
It's not a joke. Yes, or the significant abuse of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and the quality of life of farmers. Right, people don't want to farm cocoa. So what Nestle did, and you could say a lot of things about Nestle CSR, but this is a good example. I think said, okay, we've got an issue where in 20 years, cocoa supply is going to be diminished. That is one product that we could not supply, we couldn't replace in our product. So let's go out and let's figure out how we proactively address farming to make sure that we've got farmers who have quality of life, that they have the tools and training that they need to effectively reap yield that if there's something that we need to do for the products, that we can do that, right? So they've taken this approach of saying, okay, we've got to sort of protect our supply. Now that also benefits, of course, all the other cocoa producers or people who use cocoa, but in the long run, that will benefit them.
Right.
Now, look at another example, which is Hersheys. So what has Hersheys launched in the last year? I'm not sure everybody pays as much attention to chocolate as I do.
I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get that one.
So Hersheys has launched, it's okay, no judgment. Hersheys has launched the Hersheys Gold, right?
Okay.
The Hersheys Gold, which is supposed to be like a caramel chocolate bar, has no chocolate in it. So Hersheys is saying, okay, we're going to start cultivating the market for other products that don't rely on cocoa versus Nestle, who's trying to get ahead of it to say, we don't think that market's necessarily going to change. So two different strategies, but the social issue one would say we've got a couple different issues happening here.
Yeah.
How do we get in front of the supply chain to address that?
Got it. Okay.
And then the third is collaborative clusters. Now, this one is the most, and I usually do leave this to last because it is a little bit complex. But in Indy, we have a great example. So collaborative clusters say, how do we work together to address an issue that's impacting both of us negatively? So what is everybody in the tech scene worrying about right now?
We worry a lot about talent. Where do we get talent? We worry about diversity.
Okay.
We're in the Midwest.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about the talent acquisition piece right now. So if I was going to say, all right, Mike, you're going to hire a new developer, they're going to cost you $50,000 a year right out of school. I don't know if that's an accurate number or not.
It's not, but that's cool.
Okay, cool. So you're going to say $50,000 and then they're going to work for you for 2 years. And then I'm going to say, hey, come on over and work for me. Justin's going to come work for me. I'm going to pay him $5,000 more. He'll like it for a little while because I'll have like a bigger kegerator and maybe a pool table, and that'll be okay. And then you'll say, hey, look, we got a whole bunch of new houses. Be like, oh, new houses. And then you're going to steal him back 2 years later for another $5,000 on top of that. So basically, collectively, over the course of 4 years, we just competed ourselves into an extra $10,000 a year for the same person. Right. As opposed to saying, how do we take this and how do we collaborate to say, let's get more tech talent in the scene so that Justin still has a great quality of life, but we're able to compete on a national market.
Yeah.
Right. So Indy thrives collectively instead of, nickel and diming each other for talent. So that's a great example of collaborative clusters. You have to be careful, of course, that it doesn't go into monopolistic price fixing, those kinds of things. You can get into some dangerous territory.
Cartels are fun.
Cartels are fun. Oh my gosh. I'm just talking about mint chocolate chip ice cream. But so that's the third, right? Yeah. Again, all of these can be, they have to be done strategically.
Yeah.
Right? There's not any one way to do any of it.
Those are great examples. So let's do a thought experiment. So we have a startup in our portfolio. I'm on the board of a startup called Waterlis. You and I have talked about Waterlis a little bit in the past. So Waterlis does provide software for small municipalities to better do EPA reporting, for mandatory EPA reporting for water treatment, and in the future, eventually wastewater treatment. So the idea is, if you live in small town America, so think population under 50,000 people, there's still probably a guy who gets in an F-150 every day, and he drives around that town to go to various water towers and pumping stations and things like that. And he pulls out a clipboard and he writes down on that clipboard meter readings and things like that. Goes back to the office at the end of the day, types all that stuff into an Excel spreadsheet. At the end of the month, he sends that Excel spreadsheet to the EPA for his state. And then, in theory, then all of those states take that data, roll it up, and send it to the federal EPA. And this can provide tons of insight into the state of water overall, how much is being pumped, where it's being pumped, how much radiation is in your water, how much chlorine people are adding, just all sorts of, or fluoride, probably not chlorine, but I think they also had chlorine. But there's just tons of chemicals that get added. So just understanding that on a national scale so that you can then start to say things like, well, we can now forecast water shortages. We can forecast where the cleanest water is. We can, the difference between groundwater and surface water, all that kind of stuff. So for us today, we're still in minimum viable product territory. We're in one state today that we're trying to roll out to. So we do the bare minimum, right? Like how do I replace your clipboard? We're not doing anything predictive on water shortages or anything like that. Like there is a big vision, especially if you talk to Chris, the CEO of that business. Yes. He'd love to tell you how Waterlis is the first step in changing the world for the future water shortage that is coming.
Yes.
But we're not there. So at the stage that we're at, which is, scrappy startup, venture backed, minimum viable product, trying to get to revenue break even so we can hit our next funding milestone. How do you authentically, there is a bigger story that we'd like to tell around the mission and how we think we can make the world a better place, but we're not really doing that yet. We're not making the world a better place. We're just making the guy who's in the F-150, we're making his job a little bit easier. But that's building the foundation that will allow us to make the world a better place. How do you, when you hear that, how do you then say, great, that's a good down payment. Now this is the path to really turning that into a transformative aspirational business or whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I think the first thing would be allowing Chris room to put that vision to life, right? So there's one thing to be saying, here's where we're at in the process, but here's the big vision, because that's what people are going to get excited about, right? So I'd be curious to know more about when he says, this is a world-changing business. Why? How? What's the end vision for what you want this thing to do down the road? Because when I think about the Sustainable Development Goals and what you're talking about right now, that aligns in a few ways, right? With clean water, with life above land. There's a whole aspect in there on responsible consumption and production. So that falls, I think, within that Sustainable Development Goal. So when you look at those goals, you say, what are you doing? Really, at the end of the day, what gets you out of bed, Chris, right? Simon Sinek says, start with why. I love that. But then he doesn't really tell you what to do next, except go sell your why, which I don't think is really as robust as it could be. So what's your vision, Chris? What are the Sustainable Development Goals that you're working towards that people can understand? And then you can say, what are the metrics that we're going to use to prove that that's working? So we believe that by having better data and better metrics, we can reduce water usage in municipalities by 25%. I'm just making stuff up, right? Or we can reduce water waste by 75%, right? Whatever those metrics are that you think you can do. And then how do you know that that's actually working? How do you work towards those metrics?
This is impact, right?
This is that impact metric.
Yes.
How do we know that we're going to do it? And then from the startup phase, where that gets really exciting is that there's this whole new world of impact investors now saying, I want to invest in technology that is going to yield ROI, but I also want it to change the world. So I know that it makes people's jobs easier. And I know that I'm going to spin off a return that's above market rate. But at the same time, I'm going to reduce water waste. That's pretty awesome. And you can look at foundations for that sourcing. You can look at private venture capital firms. There are a lot of organizations who are looking into impact investing.
As a quick aside, I can't remember them off the top of my head. You shared some resources to look at impact investors over time. Do you know some of those off the top of your head?
Yeah. The best one or the most comprehensive is the Global Impact Investment Network, which is called the GIN. So it's the GIN with 2 I's.org. And they have a great website that talks about what is impact investing. There's some benchmarks and tools on what impact investors are looking for. So that's a really cool one. The other one, the Case Foundation, has an impact investment map that'll allow you to say, here's what we're working on. Here's our seed stage or our series stage that we're looking at. Here's the region that we're looking to impact. And then it'll tell you who's funding in that space.
Yeah, that one was a cool one. Do you remember the URL for that one?
I think it's just impactinvestmentmap.com. But if you go to casefoundation.org, you can get to it pretty easily.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
All right. So give Chris room to cast a vision, figure out how you're going to measure impact, and then go after impact investors. And then when you then think of product, so should the next step in product be, or what's the balance when you think of developing product of features that are going to make it easier to measure impact or maybe allow you to get more granular on measuring impact versus features that are going to allow you to iterate faster into the market, right? So which are going to make your other KPIs look better, right? The more classic businessy KPIs like revenue and customer acquisition and stuff like that. What's the right balance there when you think of those two things?
I think it depends on what you're trying to do. So I think if you're going to be looking for funders based on that impact investing, you've got to make sure that your metrics are solid. But I don't think you should lose the fundamental business iteration in the vein of getting data, right? Those two things need to evolve together, but you've got to have an MVP of your metrics to prove that it works at the same time that you've got an MVP for your product. So the other piece that I would add to that is thinking about product features in the long term and making sure that everybody's on the same page. I can think of a client of mine right now, and I won't say names on this one, but I think you'll know who it is too, who had an app that was focused on gaming, right? And there was this opportunity for them to go into gambling, right?
Yes.
And so there was a lot of pressure for them to say, the gambling is going to be the long-term, more lucrative market. So this is where we'd like to go. But that wasn't where their heart was. And they were sort of fundamentally opposed to this concept of gambling because they saw that as detrimental to the people who gets stuck in that addiction. And so they didn't want to do that. And so having a vision early on that would have said, this is what we're going to do, would have helped them avoid a lot of that conversation down the road where they were feeling pressure to do something that wasn't in alignment with where they wanted to be.
And in theory, would have attracted investors and partners and talent to the team that would know not to even go down that path from a conversation.
Yeah, potentially. And of course, that was a long time ago, right? None of this conversation was even as robust as it is today with social entrepreneurship, but I think it would have saved them a lot of pain if we'd had that insight then.
All right. I want to switch gears entirely now. Help me, and probably a lot of people who are listening, help contrast the difference between what I hear you talk about with social entrepreneurship and building an aspirational business, which I think is very much on target for who I think is listening to this podcast, somebody who's thinking about starting a business, versus corporate social responsibility. And which I think in a lot of conversations, if you listen to other podcasts on the topic, or if you're reading a casual article, they're conflated a lot. Like they're talked about the same thing. Can you maybe draw a contrast between the two, and what are the different concerns, and how would that affect somebody who's maybe stepping into this space for the first time?
Yeah. So we talk a lot about aspirational brands, and an aspirational brand is one that wants to pull off something big, right? They talk about it all day long, but they don't necessarily back it up with proof, right? And so I think about CSR, or corporate social responsibility, in a similar vein, which is we know that we need to do something. We have created a foundation, or we've created a team, or we've created some way that we have sort of this arm of our organization that's responsible for making sure that we're being responsible to our community. But they are not often baked in to the C-suite's vision of what they need to be doing. So a CSR team says, okay, we're going to grant money, we're going to do volunteer programs, we're going to give away product, right? They're responsible for managing the relationship of the organization in the community. Maybe they do some lobbying, maybe they manage some of the PR angles, right? It depends on the organization. So that's great because organizations need to do something. But if it's separate from the C-suite, then it is not inherently going to be managed at all levels of the organization. So my view is corporate social responsibility is currently seen as something that lives outside the leadership of the organization, right? Maybe they're damage control at worst. That's a worst case scenario. Maybe they are trying to help lead strategy, but unless they're sitting at the C-suite, they're not going to be able to do that effectively. So it's a Band-Aid, or it's a nice to have. So when I look at aspirational businesses and social enterprise, the difference for me is that it is baked into the blood and the processes and the vision of the organization. They're different things, which is why you can have Volkswagen, or you can have a Wells Fargo, right? You can have these organizations that have great dollars associated with corporate social responsibility, but at the end of the day, they're still not necessarily always doing the right thing. Contrast that with IKEA, who I think has done a great job of building sustainability into the organization. And everybody internally lives that vision. It's not just their CSR team. They have a CSR team also. They have a community engagement team. But when you look at the leadership, they're talking about it.
Right. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Do you have examples, and it's okay if you don't, do you have examples of that on a smaller scale? And I know that's going to be harder to come by just because nobody's doing Harvard Business Review articles on a small startup. But do you see, and maybe even particularly in digital products, do you see any good examples of smaller up and coming products where the leadership team really does appear to be aligned behind a vision for what they're doing and how they're going to change the world and have impact?
Yes, there are a lot, actually, just because of what I do. So one really, there's so many. I'm trying to think of how to do that. A lot of times it's in the product itself. So especially in early stage, it's that vision of saying, okay, this is what we're working on building, and this is what it's going to do in the long run, right? So right now there's an organization that has figured out how to do STD testing in Africa that's based on mobile applications. So it provides privacy and discretion in creating some STD testing that happens in a bathroom, and you can get your app, just your prescription sent to you, and you can get your prescription without ever having to see a physician, right? So that's a pretty cool, and that's baked into the process. Waterlis is a good example. There's another startup out of Baltimore that's figured out how to do health savings accounts, but they're charitable giving health savings accounts. So you as an employee say, I'm going to give $50 out of my paycheck, and it creates a charitable giving account that gives you a dashboard at the end of the report or at the end of the year. You can donate to, if Mike's going to give, if you're going to give, $20 to the Humane Society on your birthday, I can say, hey, happy birthday, Mike, here's $20 for me too out of my health savings account. It's all gamified and socially based. And then you can go ahead and, as an employer, look at that at the end of the year too. So it's a pretty cool system. They're working at credit unions and they're looking at employers to be able to talk about how they do that. So that, that's going to increase charitable giving in a world where United Way is not necessarily the preference of millennials. So that's going to be something that's coming. Those are probably the best examples of how it's baked into the organization. Of course, around here in Indy, we have organizations that do this by building culture, volunteer engagements, and financial giving. I'm thinking about Waterlis Group. Really, a lot of True You organizations would fit into that, where they're paying attention to what's the bigger vision of our organization and how do we engage in that meaningfully. So again, at that smaller level, we don't have resources. If you've got a team of 50 people, you don't have resources to create an entire CSR team, right? Most organizations at that point would be happy to have an HR person on staff, right? Or if they can't, they don't have a PEO to help them through that, that's maybe the next thing on their mind. It's not a CSR team. So you've got to be able to ingrain it into your leadership team as a part of the expectations that go with their everyday roles.
How do you do that?
By working through the aspirational business model. What's our vision? How do we know that it's working? And how do we know that we're going to measure it? How do we take care of our employees? How do we make sure that our processes align with that vision? And then how do we market based on what we've already done?
If you had a leadership team and you've gone through the process of, it's funny, I was in a board meeting earlier this week for a different business, not one of mine. And we were talking about, it's a professional services firm. We were talking about, what are the 5 key KPIs that you would measure, and then who within the organization specifically owns that KPI, meaning their bonus is tied to whether or not that KPI exists or is being met. And so you think professional services, whether it's a consulting company, a law firm, a marketing agency, right? Like they all kind of have the same thing, right? You've got sales and marketing, you've got some KPIs around that, right? So cost of customer acquisition could be one, total cost of sales could be one, right? So something about how effective are we at getting new customers in the door. Could also have a retention number in there, customer satisfaction number, which would be a little bit more on the delivery side, which would be very common in that kind of a business. And then you've got classic things that would point to profitability. So profit margin, percent of administrative overhead for professional services business is a really big thing. So some key numbers in there. So let's say you picked 4 or 5 of those. You're the CEO. You now need to find somebody in your organization who owns each of those, is accountable for those, and is watching those numbers. So now in an aspirational business model, you're measuring impact. So you've got another set of numbers. Is it the same thing? Are you then saying, okay, who in the organization is best positioned to own this number? And it's going to be the person who is now watching not just our profit margin or profitability per project, but is now also making sure that we're hitting our goal of a livable wage or sustainable wage for all of the subcontractors that we're leveraging, whether they're in the United States or overseas or whatever the case may be. Like, is that how you think of it? It's I'm going to have two sets of numbers. They're treated equally, and I'm making sure somebody in the organization explicitly owns them and is bonused based on them.
I think the CEO needs to own it. And then you have roll-up numbers to it. So for instance, if you're the CEO and you say, okay, we're responsible for making sure that these are the financial KPIs that we're going to hit in the next 3 years, right? We're growth focused. These are the growth numbers we want to hit. And we're also going to manage to these social impact numbers, which is whatever we've decided they are. CEO has to look at that, because if you say this is what you're all about, if you say you're all about impact and profitability, and all of a sudden you're not making impact, you as the CEO have to be able to understand why that's happening and what are you going to do to make sure that you're doing both. Now, you don't have to, but if you say that you are going to do this and then to build impact and you don't, that there's probably a risk element that's hanging over your head that you need to address. Right? Head in the sand isn't going to be an effective strategy to avoiding that if you say you care about impact. So you have to measure both, and you have to be able to make decisions based on that as the CEO. Now, your CFO, I think CFOs are a great ally in this. When I started my business, I said, man, the day that I've got enough data that I can convince a CFO that this is a thing will be the day that I've got it made. And what's happened is actually the CFO is my biggest ally, because they're looking at money that's being spent in the community and they can't justify why that's a good investment. And they have other investment priorities that they need to weigh in. So being able to have those metrics makes it a lot easier for the CFO to justify where the dollars are being spent.
Right.
So that's how I think. And then everybody's responsible for it. IKEA has a TED Talk on designing for sustainability that's really insightful. And the person in that TED Talk says when they went to a sustainability metric, I think I'm trying to remember now exactly what it was, but they had one specific metric in particular that they were going to go for. And they said zero tolerance, right? We're going to be 100% at this metric across all organizations across, regardless of what you're responsible for, you need to make sure that your organization is at 100% of the sustainability metric. And I'm sorry now that I can't remember what it is. But what he says is, because if we had said we're going to go 95%, everybody would have spent all their time justifying why they should have been in that 5%, as opposed to spending their time figuring out how they were going to get to 100%. So I thought that was really insightful. Everybody needs to own it.
Awesome. I'm going to switch gears again.
All right.
So you and I met maybe 8 years ago-ish? 7?
I think it's been longer. It's been back when I was at Zeke. So I think it's probably been 10 years. You were not doing this. Correct.
When we met.
Correct.
I'd love to hear the story about how you went from kind of where you were at Zeke, which was classic marketing services role, right? To being so focused on social entrepreneurship and building aspirational businesses. What happened over the last 10 years? Whether it's a trend that you saw or an itch that you're trying to scratch, or like tell that story a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah. So the reality is that my entire career has been about trying to figure out how we build profitability and purpose. I just didn't realize it until 6 years ago. So the running joke is that when I came out of school, I went to a trucking company because the job description said, the thing most team leaders talk about is the ability to make a difference in the lives of others. I was like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I know I want to do that. Right. So I ended up managing truckers for 8 years and doing safety and logistics and management. And it was a great experience. I got a nice thick skin, you can call me just about any name you want. It won't faze me. And I learned a lot about the business realities, right? So it was that was the point of saying, I want to make a difference in the lives of others, but the business realities are front and center in logistics and especially in trucking, right? Because those margins are low. Yeah. So there's nowhere to hide.
Yeah.
So I went back, I got my master's in organizational leadership, right? I know that these two things can coexist. Where do they coexist? And I wasn't able to figure it out in the trucking industry. And I thought, well, maybe it's just where I'm at. Maybe it's operations that can't move this. So that was why I went into marketing. And then I spent really the next, makes me feel old to say, the next 8 years in marketing agencies saying, how do I figure out who owns this? It must be marketing, right? Because we always just throw it to marketing. It's just cause marketing. That's who owns it. And up until 8 years ago, that really was kind of who owned it. So I spent a lot of time saying, how do we help nonprofits market? How do we help businesses market? How do we help businesses think about their community engagement piece? And I started there, but that wasn't working either. That wasn't generating purpose and profitability in the way that I thought that it should. And so it was the shared value article then that I read about 5 or 6 years ago, where Michael Porter was talking about the 3 ways that businesses can build social impact and profitability. And it was that moment of saying, there's a way to do this. I knew there was a way to do this, but I didn't know what it was. So I flew out to Boston, got certified in that. I spent 3 days learning how you do this, locked in a room. I was the only person from the US there. There were about 25 of us. And learning how to do this. And I came back and I thought it was going to be the greatest thing ever, right? I can mint money, right? I can do this. It's going to be incredible. And everybody said, well, that's really awesome, but it sounds really hard. So then the move became, all right, so what does that look like here? How does this take a Midwestern turn that we can get on board with it and move it forward in our organizations in a way that's accessible and makes sense to our cultural fit? And so then that's where the aspirational business was born. So it's all the same stuff. It's just taken me a long time to figure it out.
Is there a risk if I'm thinking about launching a business? There's certainly a risk that I could view an aspirational business model as I would view it as a marketing gimmick or fundraising gimmick and not truly internally believe in it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, well, this is the trendy thing to do. So how can I pivot my current startup idea in a slight way to make it seem like it's an aspirational business or social entrepreneurship, so I can go after funding that, maybe a larger pool with fewer candidates going, that's the goal when you're funding, right? Like find the pool of money that nobody else is going after. Right. Or if I'm a not-for-profit, I have more of a not-for-profit motive. Maybe I can, again, try to think of, well, is there a way to pivot this to maybe make it more of like a B Corp or a for-profit? Mm-hmm. Again, so I'm not competing for grant money, but I'm competing for a different pool of investment dollars. And when I say that, it feels like the thing that I'm trying to get across there is inauthenticity, right? Like how does any kind of new idea where there's landscapes like Jen and, and some of the maps that show where investment activity is happening, how do they protect against people entering kind of in an inauthentic way? And over time, one would expect if that happens, it's really going to water down the scene and create bad actors. And you'll have stories of that are going to come out of that, which will show that like, oh, well, this is bullshit, just like everything else, right? Like it's, there's nothing really here. This is no different than, a BP oil spill, and then suddenly a bunch of money gets invested in environment, air quotes there, environmental projects. Well, we know that that's not because they necessarily believe in the environment. It's because they want some good press to go along with the bad press. Now, maybe BP does believe in the environment, and I'm not like that. That's not a policy statement, but like when it happens right after a really bad thing, it's definitely PR, right? So how do you think about that? And what do you think as an industry, if you look, because you're also not the first, like the only one in the last 5 years to really start pivoting hard towards the space. Yeah. So as more attention goes there, how do you keep out the posers, and how do you protect the idea that you're trying to build? What do you think is, if you had to forecast out, what do you think that looks like over the next 5 years, 10 years?
It's a tough question. I think the first thing is, if you want to get impact investment dollars for your big idea, you have to be able to prove impact to start. And that doesn't happen overnight. So you've got to be a year down the road and trying to get this done to get to those metrics before anybody's really going to fund you anyway. You've got to prove it. So that's a long time to commit to something, right? So I think the posers will wash out at a significant degree before they get to that point. The second piece is if you are starting a nonprofit and you're working towards, or not a for-profit, a social enterprise, and you get to the beginning and you say, well, this is what I think I can get, and this is how I think it'll work. And a year out the road, you've figured out that you can build profit and you can have purpose. I think that that's compelling enough that you would want to continue, right? I think when people realize firsthand that they can build both of those things, that going back to do anything else is going to feel less meaningful. So I think that there's a personal element to it that sucks you in. If you've talked to somebody who believes that they're changing the world in their business, there's a tangible quality to their enthusiasm and passion for the business that comes from that knowledge that you are changing the world. So I think that it's self-sustaining in that way. Are there going to be bad actors? Yeah, there's bad actors now. One of my students last semester, we were talking about Tom's shoes, and he really had a strong emotional reaction, disgust to their marketing video that we looked at in class. And he said, we can't fight the simulation. The simulation's already won. The ability to understand whether it's PR or whether it's baked into the business model, that's already kind of obfuscated, right? His word, not mine. It's already hard to tell. He said the best we can do is be constant critics of motivations and the actions that these organizations are taking. So, I mean, the bad players are already out there. We've got to be looking at them with a critical eye to understand if we really want to support them, their enthusiasm and time and talents.
All right. If people want to learn more, where do they find you? Plug the book. One is, where can they pre-order a copy? All that kind of stuff. Somebody wants you to come in and talk with them in their organization. How do they do that? Give the pitch.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of ways that somebody could engage with me. You can go to aspirational.business, and that'll take you to the page that will let you pre-purchase the book. If you go to Aspirational Business, you can get through my navigation, or you can go to giving-spring.com. And on the website, I have a downloadable aspirational business model canvas. So much like the social business model canvas, you can download it, work through your process for building an aspirational business model. I have a free e-series that somebody can sign up with that'll walk them through a 6-week process to building their own process internally. So setting the vision, working through each of the steps we've talked about. Or obviously I do lunch and learns along with the book to bring teams together to talk about, if we were going to build an aspirational business, what would that look like? And what would everybody's role be in that?
Awesome. And you're on the social medias, right?
I am on the social medias. LinkedIn, I'm just LinkedIn/Dora Lutz. And I am apparently on the Twitters, as we found out last time, which is
you haven't posted in like over a year.
At Lutz Dora. You know what? I spent time and all I did was post about Jimmy John's, so I stopped. So
it's a good reason to stop.
No, let's talk about the things that are important to me: Jimmy John's and chocolate chip ice cream, and changing the world with aspirational businesses. I'm pretty focused, really, and my kids, I guess. We should probably throw them there too. Yeah. But they like Jimmy John's and chocolate chip cookies, or mint chocolate chip ice cream. So
you can't even keep it straight. I'm starting to just not believe you.
The ice cream.
All right. Thank you so much for being here and being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
If you're thinking of launching a SaaS product, Startup Competitors can provide data on your closest competitors, survey potential users, or provide other product validation services. Learn more at startupcompetitors.com.